Jeff, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about authority in the church. That's a very complex and difficult problem, and one where we have a lot of debate going on today. I'd like to focus on the role of the Magisterium, the hierarchy, the teaching authority in the church. And I always like to talk to you about these questions because you have a great sense of history and have studied theology from an historical perspective, which I always appreciate. So I want to begin to look at the role of the Magisterium, that is the official teaching office of the church, is found in the Pope and in the bishops in an historical perspective. Whenever we do that theologically, we always begin with the Scriptures. And I suppose the starting point here is to see that Jesus did indeed gather the 12, and he sent the disciples out to teach all nations. And once you had a community and you had a teaching mandate, somehow you had to have authority in the mix. And I suppose one of the interesting things about the New Testament then is the way they understood that authority, primarily as service.
And that's the important word. Authority is always for service in the New Testament. It never exists for domination. And in terms of teaching, that authority is important for clarifying questions as they arise. The conflict in the New Testament about whether or not one has to become a Jew first before one can become a Christian. And they gather the 12, they gather the apostles in Jerusalem for what anachronistically we like to call the Council of Jerusalem. As if
date in about the year 49, as I recall it.
Exactly. And it's we look back and say, well, this is sort of the first ecumenical council. In some ways it forms a model for that, at least theologically, that we gather the 12, the people that spoke with Jesus, who have this who have received the teaching from Jesus, and say, now how do we settle this question? Something, by the way, Jesus didn't give us an answer for, but the 12 who feel they're empowered by the Spirit feel like they can make a decision about.
And they look at Jesus as for style, don't they, and approach. The great example of that is Jesus saying that he is their servant, and at the as we find in John's Gospel, at the Last Supper, that Jesus washes the feet of his disciples and tells them then that is the kind of service that one is supposed to provide. So there's an authority linked with service as exemplified by Jesus. He's the suffering servant. He comes to try to care for the people, and he gives that striking example of washing their feet and then saying, now you go out and do it this way. Put negatively, it says, don't throw your weight around. Don't rule over others in an authoritarian way as we find among the Gentiles, as it says, or among in the secular culture. A very different style of authority.
Yeah, and again, I think that's exemplified by the way the disciples, the apostles, proceed at this so-called Council of Jerusalem. From what we have in the Acts of the Apostles, it seems rather conversational. And everyone seems to have their say about what they think is important, and they come together with some kind of consensus. Peter, significantly, seems to be one who summarizes the conversation. The person, of course, who leads the conversation is James, the so-called brother of the Lord.
And the head of the Jerusalem church.
The head of the Jerusalem church. But everybody has their say, and in the end a decision is made by the group. It's not imposed by any one person. It doesn't start at the top, wherever that might be, and trickle down. There's something about the group moving together.
Yes, and the sense is that it's the Spirit at work. Great emphasis on that. The Spirit was poured out at Pentecost. Jesus became life-giving Spirit through his death and resurrection, and now that Spirit is within the community as they go about the teaching task, and they call on that Spirit. In fact, when they at the one place they say, well, they write this letter about how they're supposed to solve this problem. It says, it seems to us and to the Holy Spirit that one ought to solve this problem in this way, that fundamentally there are certain laws that one ought to keep from Judaism, but fundamentally you don't have to become a Jew to become a Christian. That was the outcome of that Council of Jerusalem.
And they felt like this was the action of the Spirit.
And the way we divide history very often, Jeff, is in terms of up to the period of Constantine in the 4th century and later Theodosius in that century, where the church really took on a totally different character because it became the religion of the empire. The emperors then used it as the glue to try to hold it together. So there's always a matter of looking at how authority was exercised in the church up till the time of Constantine and in the 4th century. And what we see during that time was that bishops were often chosen by the people. There was almost something like popular acclamation that so-and-so in our community of faith ought to be the bishop. We had that kind of thing. but also the general sense that the bishops were chosen for their spiritual gifts, because they were in touch with the gospel, and they were seen to have a certain authority because they were in continuity then with the apostles themselves. We call that, Mark, the apostolic character of the church, that there's an ongoing continuity from the apostles in authentic teaching through these early bishops. So there was a style before the time of Constantine that had a certain democratic character to it, and very definitely a sense of continuity with the apostles.
It's very interesting how they would select these bishops. As you say, it wasn't one person, one vote, not democracy in the sense that we know that, but a sense that the people, we have a need for leadership, and our bishop has died or has been taken off captive in some persecution. We need to replace that person, and we feel like, from knowing the people in our community, that this person would be the best person to do that. So it was chosen by the people, the bishop. But at the same time, the bishop was ordained by bishops who came from neighboring communities. And this is, again, another example of that communion with the apostles, with that continuation of the apostolic ministry. And so if we were to use more contemporary terms, it's not simply that all authority came from below, that is the people, or all authority came from above, the hierarchy. Rather, the people said, this is who we want, this is who will do the job, we believe, by the Spirit acting among us, and that's sort of ratified by these other bishops. And I can imagine politically that you would have people choosing someone and other bishops saying, we're not going to ordain this somebody, or bishops from local towns pushing for a certain candidate and the people saying, no, we're not going to accept him. There's some meeting of the hearts and minds of the local communities idea and the bishops around them.
That's well put. It's sort of a dialectic from below and from above, is in your terms, and it's the combination that seemed to have been fruitful and produced great bishops, incidentally, in the early centuries, did it not?
They were selected because they were, and this is my bias obviously, they were good theologians and they had good pastoral gifts. They weren't administrators. They were people that already had these gifts. They were mature people.
Yes, indeed. Now that, with the coming of Constantine, and later in that century, the 4th century Theodosius, we had the church in a very different position, and now the bishops begin to take on more of the trappings of the Roman Empire, and they become men of rank and administrators of justice, and they carried on some of those other roles like defenders of the poor, but now it became a distinctive office, and with it were sort of these secular notions. They took on more of the character of the rulers and authorities in the culture, which, again, when you look back in the New Testament, wasn't exactly what Jesus had in mind, it seems, in terms of the leaders remaining the servants and so on, and washing the feet of others. But now, this idea of where the spiritual gifts resided were more in the monasteries, in the monks. And you began to get a split. Instead of the holiest people being the bishops, in a sense, and the spiritual guides and the best theologians being the bishops, you begin to get a split here. And the bishops become identified as secular rulers, as good administrators, and those who are really spiritual are off in monasteries and praying regularly and meditating and so on.
When Jesus talked about the kingdom, the basileia, the Greek word, I don't think he had the derivative, the basilica, in mind. That's where that word comes from. It was the Romans who thought, well, if these bishops are very much like our magistrates or senators, they need to have places where they can hold court. And that's what basilicas were about originally. And that's where you had your cathedra, your chair, your throne, essentially, where the bishop would sit and then hear the cases that came before him, the difficulties, the problems. And then they would haul a small wooden table out in the middle of these basilicas, and that's where they'd celebrate the Eucharist. When they were done, they'd haul the table away. They weren't churches in the sense that we mean those terms today.
And we would have examples of those basilicas around yet, wouldn't we?
Yeah.
And so that we get a different sense here of how the church leadership is exercising its role. And what I get out of what you said is a great borrowing from the culture. In other words, they really took on the same trappings, the same forms that was found generally in the Roman Empire.
And that's an important point, that the gospel and authority never exist in a pure form. They never do. They're always, immediately it's Jewish. As it falls from the lips of Jesus, it's Jewish. And as the church moves into the Gentile world and into the Roman Empire, it takes on Roman trappings. And it's simply that we use the political structures around us to organize our thoughts and our people. And that's a very natural thing to do.
Now, many people saw that this whole movement then led to troubles, that you got too close an identification between the church and the empire, between the religious realm and the secular realm. And I think it then would be with Pope Gregory VII that a certain reform movement took place. I locate him in the late 11th century, and a famous Pope Gregory VII, Pope Gregory the Great. And so that this Pope is very interested now in getting more autonomy for the church and getting the spiritual autonomy and maybe getting some distance, in a sense, from the political society. I think the problem from the church's viewpoint there was that the authority of the state could get to be too much, and the church wouldn't have its own ability to decide in matters of the spirit and in its own religious realm. So we often call that the Gregorian reform that lasted through the Middle Ages.
Some important things have happened from Constantine to this reform. Feudalism has appeared, for one thing. The Franks sort of invent it in the 8th century, and this is on the heels of what we call the barbarian invasions. If you're all German, you might call this the Great Migration of Peoples. It's more politically correct, but generally you call it the barbarian invasions. They move across Western Europe, and their feudalistic system where you have an overlord with vassals beneath that overlord who promise obedience to the overlord in return for a fief, a piece of land, and then together they all bond together for economic and political and military security. It's a good system for the time, but the church really buys into it in a wholesale sort of fashion. And what happens is that you have overlords who are civil rulers who are naming bishops and who are in charge of local churches in a lot of ways. And the church has lost control of itself and its own destiny. This is, of course, how the bishop gets on the chessboard. It's not because he's blessing people. He has a great deal of power and authority as some kind of an overlord.
So he fits into the feudal system.
Exactly. And authority in the church becomes feudalized. We start to talk, as people do today, about offices in the church. They'll say, what's the difference between a priest and a deacon? They say, well, a priest can do more things. He has more powers. And the bishop has the most powers of all. It's the notion that there are stages and steps and highers and lowers rather than differences of tasks, which is a more ancient sort of concept.
That's where you get sort of the hierarchy notion, that there are certain ones that are above. Incidentally, just to filter in, it's sort of a philosophical and theological concept, too, that's at work there, that all authority sort of emanates from God. We call this a Neoplatonic notion. Goes with pseudo-Dionysius as it came into the church, but that God's power is what is the source of all, and it emanates outward and down through various levels.
And it fits very well with the feudal system, by the way.
Exactly, yeah, they go together perfectly, and therefore God's power is radiated most clearly in the Pope, and then sort of in a diminishing fashion gets to the bishops and down to the clergy and eventually to the laity at the bottom, who then become rather passive dependent in this whole structure.
In the ecclesiastical parade, they're sort of right after the horses and just before the street cleaner. That's the way this all plays out. You mentioned the monasteries earlier. And
yes.
They're important because the Gregorian reform is really predicated upon a monastic reform that begins in France at Cluny in about the year 910. And a monastery was founded there precisely to be a monastery, to observe the Benedictine way of life, and separated from all kinds of other concerns that were political that had made their ways into the monasteries. And out of that monastery grew a great network of Benedictine monasteries across Western Europe, and that gave rise to the Gregorian reform, because Gregory and his cohorts were all monks in some wise, coming out of that reform and spreading that reform to the church.
And it did have sort of a purified nature to it, didn't it, to get away from, in a sense, the corruption that would be found in the feudal system.
The College of Cardinals appears in this period precisely as a way to elect a bishop of Rome, avoiding as much as possible the political importance of various families in Rome, so that we'd have a distinct group of folks who could make decisions based on what was right for the church and not was right for various families.
Okay, let's look at it historically. Now, the founding of Cluny occurs in
910.
910, yes.
In France.
Yes, and then we get the College of Cardinals.
In the 11th century.
In the 11th century.
About the middle of the 11th century.
Right, and then we had Gregory the Great as sort of a focal point for much of this reform, as pulling together some of these monastic ideals. So we had popes who were monks and who had a sense of this detachment from the world or this need to not be totally co-opted by the culture.
And brilliant people at the same time. We're not talking about simple monks hiding off somewhere, but very bright people who had great administrative abilities. And so here is in a sense, the best of Catholicism. You know, this baptizing of good stuff that we can find in the culture and taking it and co-opting it and using it, and yet using the gospel to purify it, to criticize it, to say, here are some problems here, so we're not going to eat this wholesale, but we're going to take what's good and use it.
Excellent. Now, throughout this period then in the Middle Ages with these great popes, I think what happens is they take on more and more power, right, because they are good and strong people and have a sense of reform. But you end up getting more and more of a centralizing authority in Rome as a result. And also they often take over sort of a style eventually of monarchs. They become, again, this borrowing from the culture, but they become monarchical figures, kingly kind of figures with all the trappings that go with being the pinnacle point of authority within a grouping. And
that reaches a high point with Innocent III at the beginning of the 13th century. Here is the central figure in Western Europe, and it's not simply because he's the Pope. It's because he's incredibly capable as a theologian and as a lawyer, civilly and canonically, and he makes all kinds of alliances and is very brilliant.
Mm-hmm. So Innocent III when did you early in the
early 13th century?
Yes.
Dies about 1209, I think,
Yes.
1210.
Okay, so now we move forward in this sort of centralizing thing here. Well, there's one other element I want to get in here, and that is that there's always counter movements to this. One way we saw it was in the monastic orders, or the new orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, for example, who were sort of countercultural forces, and were trying to get back to sort of the simplicity of the gospel. So maybe that ought to get into this mix, too, of how the Magisterium needs to function. They became, in a sense, critics of a style, I suppose, as found in Rome.
And the Dominicans and Franciscans really grow out of penitential movements in the late Middle Ages, people who feel like to be a Christian means to follow Christ, the poor Christ. And not all these movements ended happily. The Waldensians, the followers of Peter Waldo, ends up as a heretic, thrown out of the church because he insisted because of his poverty he has authority. Actually, Francis of Assisi comes 100 years after Peter Waldo, and one scholar I've read says that without a Peter Waldo there wouldn't be a Francis of Assisi, because we didn't handle Peter Waldo well. 100 years later, the popes had enough savvy to say we've got to find some way to keep these people who want to live a poor, simple lifestyle and live the gospel, keep them within the church.
Someone has said that while the Protestant community, when they have trouble, very often splits. They split into rival groups. What happens in the Catholic Church is you found a new religious order.
Exactly.
That's our way of dealing with this diversity and different spiritualities and different outlooks on authority in this case. Jeff, there's another thing I want to comment on here, and that is conciliarism, because there's another notion within the whole of the church here, and I link that with the Great Western Schism at 1378 to 1418 and the Avignon Papacy. That is when the Pope was out of Rome and in Avignon. They had a different idea of how this all worked within the church. The conciliarists said that the supreme authority in the church was not in the Pope but in a council. And we've had these great general councils throughout the history of the church, beginning with Nicaea in 325, and the Council of Trent is one that everyone would recognize, Second Vatican Council, 21 ecumenical councils. But the conciliarists always wanted to give more power to the council and not just to the Pope, and that was an ongoing battle, which I might say got sort of solved on the side of the people who wanted to centralize power with the Pope in 1870 at the First Vatican Council, when the definition of infallibility was given.
Conciliarism is a band-aid. It's an attempt to deal with, as you mentioned, the Great Western Schism, that there were at one time as many as 3 popes, one in Avignon, France, what we now call France, one in Pisa in Italy, and one in Rome. And they said, who's the real pope? How will we decide? And the university theologians developed this notion of conciliarism, that the council, when it's in session, is the highest authority in the church, even higher than the pope. And so when they called the Council of Constance, which ran from 1414 to 1417, when they gathered for that council, they set up an international commission of electors, and the Roman pope gave up his office. They deposed the other 2 popes, and elected a new one, and Martin V, I believe was his name. accepted the decision of the council in as much as it made him the Pope. But once he became the Pope, he wasn't much interested in conciliarism, and it died a hard death running, as you say, down to Vatican I.
Yes, conciliarism, but it did have a very practical effect, didn't it? Because it solved that thing that is called the Great Western Schism, when no one could really figure out who the real Pope was. So it ended up providing a solution, in a sense, to the Council of Constance.
And what it did recognize was that authority exists in the whole church, especially among all of the bishops. There's this ordo of bishops, and authority isn't just dropped on the Pope and it trickles down. I think, and we often look at bishops as regional vice presidents, and in fact they aren't. They are, as Vatican II says, real pontiffs in their dioceses.
Now that brings us to Vatican II, although in our historical sketch there we got up to Vatican I, which represents the high point of the centralizing authority in the papacy in Rome, that the authority, that the Magisterium is centered very much on the Bishop of Rome, someone who had been given primacy of honor from the very beginning, and we see a gradual growth in their power because of the great popes that we had, and as you said, Innocent III being a high point because of his expertise and so on, and his ability to deal in international politics and so on. But then in Vatican II, we get sort of a rethinking of this thing. Vatican I had gotten shortened, and they never got around to talking about the role of the bishops. And so Vatican II began to look at the papal authority in a wider context of the College of Bishops, so that the real successors of the apostles are not just one, the Bishop of Rome, but all of the bishops together form a collectivity, or a college, as we say. And they are the successors of the apostles, and they have a certain authority within the whole church. Now, they don't act apart from the Pope, the Council said. The Pope is like the focal point of unity in that larger college. So that begins to give us a different sense here of how authority ought to be exercised within the church.
I think it's important to realize that the Pope is first and foremost the Bishop of Rome, that he's the bishop of a particular diocese, and so he stands as a brother with all of the rest of the bishops. We also understand that as Bishop of Rome, he stands as the head of that college, the church where Peter and Paul died, the church which, as you say, there was a primacy of honor, and not just honor, but a sense of the wonderful belief of that church in Rome, as voiced eventually through the Bishop of Rome. And so there's a unity in that college. These people are colleagues with one another, following the lead of the Bishop of Rome. The image is often made of the Bishop of Rome as like the hub of a bicycle wheel, holding by way of his brother bishops, the whole of the Church Catholic together, keeping us in round with one another. And
sort of that focal point of unity. That's a good image, the hub of the wheel and the spokes going out. And so you get a lot of debate about then how the Pope is supposed to play out this role. But one of the things that Vatican II did was affirm the variety and diversity of the local churches, the great patriarchal sees with their own canon laws, their own liturgical practices, and so on. So I think that there was a greater sense of diversity that way given in Vatican II, not totally, but at least a recognition that not everyone had to do it exactly as it was done in Rome, and that the patriarchs in the larger Catholic community, like in Alexandria or Antioch or Jerusalem, would have their own legitimate authority.
Catholicity does not revolve around uniformity, I don't think. Catholicity has to do with unity and diversity, recognizing that across the church there are many different ways of expressing belief, and yet we want to try to hold together on what is essential, while letting people do things that are culturally expressive of the way that they believe.
I think what we say in the Catholic community is that we have a certain initial respect for this authority. We recognize the community has to be structured, that if Jesus gave a mandate to teach, we have to have a teaching authority. But we also recognize, and I think more so since Vatican II, certain limitations on this authority. And we might begin to look at it this way. We've got to remember they can't just do whatever they want. Their authority comes from Christ. And in one way or another, even though the community produced the Bible, the book, it still remains normative for the life of the church. So that these bishops can't just do whatever they want. They have to reflect that biblical teaching. and the central thrust of Jesus. They also, when they try to teach in an authoritative way, have to have some sort of consensus that they find within the church as a whole. In other words, they're not just apart totally from the larger community of faith. They always do better when they reflect the thinking of the whole community, are faithful to the gospel, are in tune with the thrust of Jesus, and then find persuasive arguments for their teaching.
As I understand their teaching role, it is to voice the belief of the church. And that's not something that they invent. It's something that exists already in this organism we call the church, and they give voice to it. And as you say, that means they need to reflect, and they do reflect upon the belief of the whole body, and then try to give that some kind of shape, to say it looks like this and it sounds like this. And frankly, it's a much more dynamic process than it often seems. Sometimes it seems, again, a more feudalistic vision. It's supposed to trickle down from the top. In fact, they announce the belief of the whole body, and then the body echoes back whether or not they've heard what they believe. And there's a conversation, a dialectic that goes on there.
That's well put, Jeff. I like that. Well, we've been looking now at this whole question of authority in the church and looking at it from one perspective, and that is that of the Magisterium, the word we use for the official teaching office in the church, which includes the Pope and the bishops. And we've tried to look at it historically, which I find to be very beneficial. And so we see that in history, very often this teaching authority has reflected the culture, very influenced by Rome, very influenced by becoming the dominant religion under Constantine, very influenced, as you beautifully pointed out, by the feudal system and sort of a trickle-down authority that occurred within the church. And then when we get up to Vatican II, we see trying to come back to the indeed authority has to be service, but it needs the authority of the Pope has to be put in the context of what all of the bishops are about. And then authority functions, I think, in a fruitful way.